In this second handout, we want to talk about sentence structure and larger constituents. We've been dealing with some rather small constituents in our prior handout. Here we're going to deal with larger constituents. So Roman numeral 1 here, larger constituents of a sentence. We've been learning about the main sentence patterns and what normally fills the various function slots. Subject is usually filled by the part of speech known as a noun. Object complement and subject complement are usually nouns and adjectives. Direct objects and indirect objects are usually nouns. But it is quite possible and frequent that something else can fill the slot besides what we normally expect. For example, the subject slot could be filled by an adjective functioning nominally or substantively, if you know that word. A nominal is anything that is not a noun but functions like a noun does. And so in our example here, we have the righteous are bold as a lion. The subject slot could be filled here by an adjective. Okay, the righteous are bold. Notice here that righteous is not a noun technically. Righteousness is the noun. Righteous is an adjective, but what role is it filling here? It's functioning as the subject. It's telling you what it is that are bold, or who it is that are bold. And so an adjective is functioning as a nominal item here. The subject slot could be filled by other things like prepositional phrases. This is very unusual in English, but it is possible. So take a look here. We have above the sea is the best place for me. This is a subject, verb, subject, complement sentence. And notice that the subject is being filled by a prepositional phrase. Above the sea is the subject. Our copula is, and then what is above the sea? Well, it's the best place. The subject slot could even be filled by a whole clause. That you love me is mystifying. The whole expression, that you love me, is the subject. It's what is mystifying. But notice that this involves more than just a noun. It involves more than just a noun modified by an adjective or a prepositional phrase. It's actually an entire clause. That you love me. A clause has a subject and a verb. Okay, we've got that here. That you love me, that whole idea is mystifying. If a prepositional phrase or a clause happens to fill a nominal function slot, you would put it on a standard attached to the place on the baseline of your sentence diagram where that function slot would appear. So if we take the prepositional phrase functioning as the subject in above the sea is the best place for me, notice here that this is my core baseline here. This is a subject, verb, subject complement type of baseline and sentence type. And what is filling the subject then is complicated. So I'm going to put it on a standard, which is 2 little feet with a line extending so that I can move it up above that slot and then give it its own more complex structure. Preposition here and the object of the preposition here. Notice that just like when I have a direct object for a verb, as in this type of a sentence structure, okay, objects are separated from the verb by a straight line that ends on the baseline. When I have a preposition, I have objects of the preposition, and those are separated by a little line that ends on its baseline also. All right, so you might get into thinking here about objects of one sort or another, direct objects or objects of the preposition, always being separated from the preposition or the verb by that line. So there you go. Everything else here is rather normal. Modifiers will go underneath the things that they modify. So best modifies the place. And then the preposition for me has an object. And so that will go under the noun that it modifies. And the preposition will go first, line, and then the object of the preposition here. In this other diagram, I have an example that we've already looked at. Here, not a prepositional phrase, but a whole clause is the subject of the sentence. Something is mystifying. What is mystifying? That you love me. So the word that here is just introducing the clause as a dependent clause that is functioning here as a noun, as a subject here in this case. And then notice that as I raise it on the standard, the whole clause has its own sentence structure, which is a subject, verb, direct object, right? So you love me is a state of affairs that is mystifying. I cannot put that you love me all on this line. Otherwise, I would have a baseline with all these crazy lines, and it would be hard to know exactly what is the real core of the main clause. Okay, so what we have is a clause that's embedded in the core clause, and it functions as the subject. It's a constituent of the core clause. The core clause being something is mystifying. Now, let's talk about types of clauses here. I've already used a couple of terms that I need to define, so let's do that. This brings us to a very important matter about sentences that we must understand in order to analyze properly the various clauses. Some clauses can stand alone, while other clauses are integral parts of larger clauses and not able to stand alone. So let's provide a few terms and definitions to help clarify matters here. So basic terms. Independent clauses. These are also known as matrix clauses or main clauses. Now, if you were around long enough ago to remember the movie called The Matrix, this might evoke some really interesting images. This is not really intended to evoke those images. This is a term that linguists use. Okay? Independent clauses, matrix clauses, main clauses, these are all used fairly interchangeably. These are clauses that can stand alone, contain a predicate, a verbal idea, and at least an implied, if not an explicit subject, and expresses a proposition. So examples here, Martha burned the soup. Here I have a verb or a predicate. What the predicate involves what was burned, and in this case I've got an explicit, overt subject. Martha burned the soup. Martha made Jesus a meal, and you are beautiful. These are all independent clauses. They can stand on their own. We don't feel like anything's incomplete if we utter those clauses. So these are perfectly good independent clauses. They form a complete grammatical thought. Dependent clauses are also known as embedded clauses or subordinate clauses. And these clauses are clauses that are embedded as constituents, as parts in a larger clause, in a main clause, and can stand for nouns, adjectives, and adverbs. Dependent clauses cannot stand alone like an independent clause can. So examples here, and these examples of dependent clauses or embedded clauses are italicized for us. We love because he first loved us. Think about that clause here, because he first loved us. This is an adverbial clause. Adverbial means it modifies or qualifies the verbal action in some way. Here it's telling us why. We love for what reason? Because he first loved us. Now in the second one, Paul, who was an apostle, wrote Galatians. This dependent clause, who was an apostle, is functioning adjectivally. It's functioning as an adjective. It is not qualifying the verb, but this noun, the subject noun, Paul. It's telling us something about Paul. Okay, so I'll just draw a line there to Paul. Here, I'll draw a line here to love to indicate that we're modifying different things with these dependent clauses. A who, which, or that clause that modifies a noun is also called a relative clause. Okay, so these have adjectival function. And then in the third one, I know that Ivan loves me. Here, the expression that Ivan loves me is functioning as a noun. And that's why I've described this as a nominal clause. A nominal or a nominalized clause is a clause that is forced to function as a nominal, as a noun-like thing. Here, it's the direct object of know. I know something. I know a direct object. What is it that what do I know? I know this proposition. Ivan loves me. Now notice that each of these dependent clauses, because he first loved us, who was an apostle, that Ivan loves me, none of these can stand on their own grammatically. Each of them needs the rest of the independent or the matrix clause to make sense. If I walk up to you and say, because he first loved us, you're going to wonder, what does that fragment belong to? There's something larger that belongs to, and you would be right. And the issue there is that, this is a dependent clause, and it must have an independent clause or a matrix clause to be embedded in. All right. Please note as well that the first three sample sentences under independent clauses are all independent clauses. Be aware that the three sample sentences under dependent clauses, when taken as whole sentences, are also independent clauses that can stand alone. That is to say, the main clause with its dependent clause together can stand alone, can be uttered and be grammatical, and you won't feel like anything's missing. In the latter three sentences, it is only a portion of the independent clause that by itself cannot stand alone. That portion is the dependent clause. And so what this means then is that, number one, some independent clauses have no dependent clause in them. And number two, this also means that some independent clauses do have dependent clauses. And with this in mind, we can consider a few more definitions. First of all, there are sentences that we could describe as simple sentences. What's that? An independent clause containing no dependent clauses. If there are no dependent clauses, just an independent clause or a main clause, then this is a simple sentence. For example, Jack loves Mary. Here I have a subject, a verb, and a direct object. No dependent clauses, no extra verbs with subjects hanging around. Embedded in that, it's just a simple sentence. A complex sentence is an independent clause containing at least one dependent clause. So, an example here, Jack loves Mary because she rides motorcycles. Jack loves Mary because she rides motorcycles. So, we've already diagrammed this, and when there were no embedded clauses, we were done. But here I have a because clause, and then a subject, verb, and a direct object. And this whole thing is modifying the verb loves. Tells us why Jack loves Mary. Why does this loving activity happen? It's because of her excellent motorcycle riding skills. Okay? So this is an adverbial clause. Now you will notice here that I have dropped the adverbial clause as a modifier under the verb because it is adverbial. So whatever something's modifying, it goes under that. If it's modifying a verb, it's adverbial. If it's modifying a noun, it's adjectival. Okay? Notice also that adverbial clauses modifying verbs, they will have a leftward slanting line. When we saw our prepositions describing nouns, they had a rightward slanting line. So I'm making a distinction here, and I'm following Grasmick in this, although Grasmick's resources are Greek diagramming sentence. If you flip this over, his dependent clauses would be down toward the right and over like this, but since we're doing Hebrew order, it's down to the left and over. And then you put your constituents of that clause on its own baseline. Okay? So this is the main independent clause, and the dependent clause is underneath it. The conjunction that joins the two clauses together will be written here, or maybe written right through the line. A compound sentence. What about these? A sentence that contains two independent clauses joined by a coordinating conjunction like and, but, yet, however, rather, and not a subordinating conjunction like because, when, while, after, etc. That is to say, when you have a coordinating conjunction, you are joining two grammatically equally ranked sentences or clauses together. One is not dependent on the other. One is not embedded inside the other. Rather, they are two independent clauses that have a conjunction that joins them as equally ranked clauses. In a compound sentence, each independent clause could stand by itself. So if you take the example sentence here, Jack loves Mary and she rides motorcycles, each of these independent clauses in and of themselves uttered without the conjunction could stand alone. Jack loves Mary, perfectly good sentence. She rides motorcycles, perfectly good sentence. And no doubt a great woman too. So how would we diagram these using our Reed Kellogg type diagrams? Well, each of these are clauses, so they're going to get their own baseline, and each of them have a subject, verb, direct, object structure, so we'll see that there, okay? But they are parallel to each other because they're coordinated. They're not dependent clauses. One's not dependent on the other. And this basically is described by some as a little rocket ship kind of thing. So once you've got your baselines, you're going to join them with this little angled line, and then you come back, and then you put a dotted line here, and your conjunction, your coordinating conjunction, will be written here or maybe written through that dotted line. Now let's talk about the types of subordinate clauses, and we've previewed this already, but I'm going to make it more explicit now. We could have relative clauses. Relative clauses are subordinate clauses. They are usually introduced by the relative pronoun who or whom, which or that, and usually function adjectively to modify a noun. Consider the two examples below and notice what kind of grammatical unit is modifying the word man. I know the terrible man. What kind of a word is terrible? Terrible is an adjective. And now look at the second sentence. I know the man who is terrible. I know the man who is terrible. Here, I don't have just an adjective. I have an entire relative clause. And this relative clause is modifying the man. Both the adjective terrible describes the man, and the relative clause who is terrible describes the man. And so, what we see is that relative clauses modify nouns just as adjectives do. And because of that, we're going to place relative clauses when we can below that noun's baseline where you would normally put an adjective. Sometimes it's not possible given your complicated structure, and you might have to put a relative clause somewhere else, but you'll always connect it, and I'll show you how here. All right? So, let's take a look here. Here is I know the terrible man. Subject, verb, direct object, using our sentence diagram structure. And then terrible is the adjective, and it's under man because the man is what's being modified by that adjective. Over here, I know the man, but now no longer an adjective, but a whole relative clause, who is terrible. And notice here that what I've done is I've used a dotted line to connect the word man and the relative pronoun that stands for the man. Okay? Remember, relative pronouns are pronouns, and therefore they replace the noun. They have a referent that is identical to the noun's referent. If the man that I know is, let's say, Ivan, okay, then I could replace Ivan in both of these expressions, and I would still be saying the same thing. I know Ivan. Ivan is terrible. Okay? Same person, because pronouns replace nouns. So wherever my relative pronoun is in my dependent clauses structure, I'm going to put a dotted line. Now, it doesn't have to be straight and angled like this. I could do it like this if I want. And if I had run out of room and needed to squeeze this in like way over here, for example, then I could even draw my dotted line like that and put it way out over here. So it doesn't absolutely have to go underneath the noun that's being modified by the relative clause, but you are certainly better off if you can put it there, because that's where you would expect it to go. All right. Now, the second type of dependent clause that we want to talk about is the nominal clause. The nominal clause, and again, I previewed this a little earlier. These are subordinate clauses that function as noun phrases. That is to say, they function nominally. They fill a noun function within the sentence. As we've seen, nouns usually fill the direct object slot, but so could a nominal clause. A nominal clause could be the direct object. And by the way, let me just give you one more. Actually, I give you two expressions. The nominal clause could also be described in this way. They could be described as nominalized clauses. Okay, so a nominalized clause. Or some people will refer to them as complement or complementized clause or clauses. Okay, that's where the clause is functioning as a complement of a sentence, usually a direct object. Remember, direct objects in a transitive verb sentence are obligatory, and so they would be necessary. They would be a complement. So I know Ivan. Here, Ivan is my direct object. Okay, subject, verb, direct object. I know that Ivan is terrible. Here, that Ivan is terrible is filling the same function slot that Ivan is filling in the sentence above. This whole clause then is functioning as the direct object just as Ivan is. And this is a nominal or a nominalized clause where it functions as a noun. Now, to diagram the nominal clause, you'd place it on a standard in the same place that a normal noun would go that functions in that same slot. So I know Ivan. Here, Ivan is my direct object right over here. And then I know something, but not Ivan anymore, but rather I know something about Ivan. And I'm going to put that on a standard, and then this whole clause is going to have its own internal baseline and grammatical structure. Subject, verb, subject complement. Ivan is terrible. That is what I know. Again, let me just explain something here. The reason I have to put this clause on a standard is because if I were to put Ivan right here and draw another line and then put is and then put the subject complement and terrible, I would have an unreadable baseline. The baseline needs to have a true sentence baseline, needs to have only those things that its sentence type can bear. Okay, so you can't throw 7 direct objects, 2 separate verbs, and a direct object and a subject complement all on the same baseline. Now, the third type of dependent clause is the adverbial clause. These are subordinate clauses that are introduced by subordinating conjunctions and serve to modify verb phrases like an adverb does. They are subcategorized into a number of different types, just as there are a variety of different types of adverbs. We have temporal adverbs, for example, that indicate the timing of the action. And we can have temporal adverbial clauses then that indicate the timing of the action in the subordinate clause compared to the verb of the main clause. Causal adverbial clauses. These are clauses that provide the grounds or the reasons for the verbal action of the main clause. Purpose clauses are those adverbial clauses that indicate the reason or purpose for the intention or the purpose for the main verb in the main clause, or the condition, like a conditional clause. If you do this, I will be happy. That if clause is an adverbial conditional clause. So let me give you a couple of examples here. I came yesterday. Yesterday is an adverb, and it's temporal in nature because it indicates the timing of the verb. I came when? Yesterday. Now, I could use same sentence structure, I came, but instead of using a simple adverb, I could use a whole clause, an adverbial clause. I came before today arrived. This is a temporal adverbial clause, and notice that with my simple sentence here, I came, yesterday is under came because this is an adverb telling when the coming happened. And here, the adverbial clause is under the verb, I came. I came when? Before today arrived. And notice as well that it's slanting to the left and then starting the baseline, whereas the prepositional phrase and the adverbs and adjectives, these all hang under what they modify and they go to the right. The distinction being this, and Grasmick explains this in his section on line diagramming. Whenever I have modifiers hanging off of a baseline, if they are not verbal in any way, then they are attached with a slanting down line to the right. If they are verbal in some way, then they'll either hang off of the main baseline with a straight line or with the line slanting to the left, as we have here. Infinitives we'll use the straight line. They're verbal but not finite verbs. And then if I have an adverbial clause that actually uses a finite verb, then it will slant to the left. Okay? So we will follow that convention that Grasmick follows. Anyhow, that is our handout on larger constituents. I hope that helps.